welcome. My name is Mark Swislocki. I teach in the history program at NYU Abu Dhabi, and it is a pleasure to introduce Jamal Aden, Associate Professor of History at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Professor Aden studied at Boğaziçi University, Istanbul University, the University of Tokyo, and then received his PhD in History and Middle Eastern Studies at Harvard University in 2002. Aden's publications include the book Politics of Anti-Westernism in Asia, Visions of World Order and Pan-Islamic and Pan-Asian Thought, as well as, among many other works, a co-edited special volume on critiques of the West in Iran, Turkey, and Japan, and the important article Globalizing the Intellectual History of the Idea of the Muslim World. He's currently working on a related book manuscript on the intellectual history of the idea of the Muslim world, forthcoming from Harvard University Press. I would like to thank the New York University Abu Dhabi Institute for making this opportunity possible, and I would also like to take this opportunity to say a few additional words to help set the stage for tonight's talk, which is the first in a series of 4 talks organized by the NYU Abu Dhabi History Program on the subject of how to write a history of the world. I'll begin by saying that I only met Jamal last night, a fact that I would like to linger on momentarily, since I think that doing so may anticipate some of the questions that our speaker may be entertaining tonight, if only indirectly. I only met Jamal last night at an event where he presented his thoughts on the writing of world history to a small gathering of students and faculty. We began by introducing ourselves to Jamal, and it soon became apparent that he had various forms of shared history with those in attendance, some previously known and temporarily forgotten, others only discovered in the course of the evening. One colleague had met Jamal at an Arabic language institute, where Jamal was an advanced student and the colleague only a beginner. Or, as we might put it, were these two people nation-states, they met as developed and undeveloped nation-states. Another colleague turns out to have shared a dissertation director with Jamal, unknowingly. Or, as we historians might note, they belonged to the same empire, training in the director's metropole and then heading out to form colonies of like thought and institutions around the world. By the time it came for me to introduce myself, I could only say that I knew of no prior meeting or connection to the speaker. However, as he spoke, I quickly realized how wrong I was. We had never met, but we shared a set of intellectual preoccupations as historians, how to write histories of the world that are not wholly beholden to categories of nation or empire, and that are also not Eurocentric, and likewise how to write regional histories that are also neither so beholden nor so centric. I should have not been surprised to find this similarity. After all, I was part of the group that invited Jamal to speak as part of our lecture series. What I was surprised to see, however, was how our personal introductions that night also seemed to model, in microcosm, the problem of writing world history, of peoples, if not people, nations, empires, or regions coming into contact at different levels of development, for lack of a better word perhaps, and of how those points of contact may be fleeting or lasting and deeply influential, possibly forgotten, even denied, only later to be remembered and claimed to have always existed, creating legacies that develop both chronologically and retrospectively simultaneously. Or perhaps unknown connections that become apparent when some historian sits down and tries to figure out what explains the global social configuration in question. Historians have been trying to do this ever since there was something that might be called history, at least in the 2 texts of early history with which I am most familiar, and which I teach side by side in a course for the NYU Abu Dhabi core curriculum, one objective of which is to be global and comparative. These 2 texts are Herodotus's The Histories and The Records of the Grand Historian by Sima Qian. For Herodotus, history meant inquiry, and he conducted his inquiry so that, in his words, human achievements may not be forgotten in time, and great and marvelous deeds, some displayed by Greeks, some by barbarians, may not be without their glory, and especially to show why the 2 peoples fought with each other. The two peoples were, in fact, many peoples. The Greeks were not one people, nor were the non-Greeks. And to identify their historical significance, or their significance to his inquiry, Herodotus looked back into remote time for a single guiding thread. It eventually becomes clear that his lengthy inquiry, which some scholars speculate may actually have originated as a geography and ethnography of the known world, is ultimately the origins of the Greco-Persian Wars and of how the Greeks defeated the Persians. In between these origins and the final battles is his survey of the known world, rich in ethnographic detail, most famously of the Egyptians, but also of the Lydians, the Persians, the Babylonians, the Mesogetæ, the Ethiopians, the Indians, the Scythians, the Libyans, and the Thracians. These groups, however, are introduced not randomly, but placed in the overall narrative where the relevant group comes into contact with the Persians. The origins of war and the Greek defeat of the Persians, cross-cut by the march of the Persians through these different regions, was Herodotus's organizing principle for managing the raw data of this incredibly diverse world, though his inquiry ultimately illustrated, in the words of one of his translators, the conflict between freedom and slavery. Such was Herodotus's perspective on these events, at least. At least this is what we could call his meta-narrative, the very kind of organizing principle that historians today are sometimes reluctant to adopt, even while recognizing that this rejection of comprehensive explanations may mean that we ultimately lose the interest of what we call wider audiences, which we usually assume want comprehensive explanations. Worlds away, a few centuries later, Sima Qian, who in one meta-narrative became known as the Chinese Herodotus, also wrote a history of his known world, which stretched east to west from today's Korea to northern Afghanistan, and from north to south, from the Mongolian plateau, home of the Xiongnu at the time, to what is today southern China, at the time home to a number of relatively independent polities. Also a very diverse land. Like Herodotus, Sima Qian also reached far back in time to remote figures whom we surely would today call legendary, although he did so from his standpoint as the court historian of the Han Empire, circa 100 BCE. Unlike Herodotus, who wrote one continuous narrative to make sense of and explain his world, Sima Qian opted for a disjointed work, consisting of 5 annals, 10 chronological tables, 8 treatises, 30 accounts of notable hereditary houses, and 70 shorter monographs, some biographical and some geographical. Each of these categories had their own distinctive narrative form and presentation in the text, and they numbered 130 chapters in all. Some historical figures appear in more than one chapter, often in different guises, suggesting to readers that Sima Qian's disjointed, non-chronological, and often fragmentary work somehow anticipates the non-linear narrative styles celebrated by postmodernism. This possibility, whatever one makes of it, sits in a productive tension with Sima Qian's own explanation of what he thought he was doing to make sense of the world. As he wrote, "I have gathered up and brought together all of the old traditions of the world that were scattered and lost. I have examined the events of the past and investigated the principles behind their success and failure, their rise and decay. I wished to examine into all that concerns heaven and humankind, to penetrate the changes of the past and present, putting forth my views as one school of interpretation." This was not, as it sounds, easy, and it appears that Sima Qian was not quite always sure himself just how to do it. Perhaps because, unlike Herodotus, he was the court historian of the Han Empire, for which the writing of history was a principal vehicle for articulating political legitimacy. And yet he appears to have been naturally inclined toward a kind of intellectual skepticism. He appended short explanations to each chapter of his book, saying why he wrote it and what it illustrated about the principles behind success and failure. Read collectively, however, they seem more than anything to reveal the difficulty that the Chinese historian faced in trying to make objective statements about history and its causes. Sometimes he appears to invoke a vague fatalism, a purported impersonal force called heaven, only to be attacked by scholars and bureaucrats for ignoring human causes in history. But then, when he was too frank about the human failings of rulers, he was likely to become entangled in discussions of imperial destiny, perilous discussions of imperial destiny. Earlier in his life, he had been subjected to the punishment of castration for daring to speak on behalf of a friend he had felt unjustly blamed for a failed military campaign against the Xiongnu. It's perhaps not surprising, therefore, that Sima Qian often tried to split the difference with veiled words. I'm now far from where I started with my seemingly casual remarks about having only met Cemal yesterday, but I hope I have said something to foreground some of the challenges of writing world history, of finding explanations that work for both clearly connected and seemingly disparate events, and of the potential stakes and risks of doing so. I can only imagine that the world to which we will be introduced tonight will be as complex as those of Herodotus and Sima Qian. I'm eager to hear what our speaker will make of it. I have nothing but admiration for Cemal for taking on this challenge, and I trust you will find his ideas as engaging and provocative as I do. Please join me in warmly welcoming our speaker, Cemal Aydin.
Good evening, and I would like to start by thanking NYU Abu Dhabi campus and history program for inviting me and for actually organizing a public lecture. This is one of the important needs of our societies, and living in America for the last 20 years, we always face these challenges, how to connect the scholarly knowledge with the public knowledge. And I have been involved in the American part of this story, and I see that there are more public interest in academic lectures in Abu Dhabi than in the United States. So I should say that. Today, I have the lecture ready. Today, I would like to start with one big question, is that when President Obama came to power as a presidency, one of the first things he did is that he wanted to make a speech to the Muslim world. And he chose Cairo for that, and probably many of you know that famous speech that he gave in Cairo. Meanwhile, of course, many of us also ask this question, is that, is there such a thing, Muslim world? Why is he only making a speech to the Muslim world? For example, why doesn't he make a speech to the Christian world, or the Buddhist world, or the atheist world? Or could we imagine, a Muslim leader, let's say Emir of Abu Dhabi, or Saudi king, or Prime Minister of Turkey, going to Washington, D.C., to a university campus and addressing to the Western world or the Christian world? But what comes out from President Obama's speech and the responses and the context is that globally, many people that there is something called the Muslim world. And it's not only the Europeans and the Americans, but the Muslims themselves also believe in this world. So today, I want to first make an exercise on global history, global intellectual history, try to understand the origins of this concept, the Muslim world. And I will make the argument that this concept is not originating from Prophet Muhammad or the Quran. It's a modern concept born around 1860s, 50s to 60s, born in the middle of the 19th century. And its content and many of its characteristics was shaped from 1870s to 1930s. And we are somehow still dealing with the legacy of that concept and its content. And I'll try to describe this content based on this period from 1860s to 1930s, the peak of some sort of a Pan-Islamic Muslim identity. And by doing so, I want us to reflect on why this concept persists while similar concepts like the Black African world or the yellow race, concepts that were very contemporary to the idea of the Muslim world, gradually faded away, but we are still talk about Islam and the West and the Muslim world. But before I do that, I want to start with one of my favorite singer, Sami Yusuf, and his song called My Ummah. And I want you to pay attention to the lyrics.
my Ummah, he will say, Rasulullah on that day, even though we've strayed from him and his way. My brothers, my sisters in Islam, let's struggle, work and pray, if we are to bring back the glory of his way. Ya Allah, Ya Rabb al-Alamin, Ya Rahman, Ya Rahim, Ya Rabbi, let the Ummah rise again. Ya Allah, Ya Rabb al-Alamin, Ya Rahman, Ya Rahim, Ya Rabbi, let the Ummah rise again. Let us see daylight again, once again.
I highlighted in this very popular song by the British Muslim singer Sami Yusuf a couple of lines that kind of reflects the broader Muslim sentiments. And we talk about the sentiments, and some of them are, bring back the glory of his way. It refers to Prophet Muhammad's way. But there are a couple of things that glory of the past, let us bring back our glory, and Ummah rise again. And I found this song quite interesting in the sense that of course, this is not a historical argument or a thesis, but in terms of the emotions, that is very common among millions of Muslims that we can observe, that there's a sense that Muslims are united, and they started in the 6th or 7th century, created a great civilization with a golden age, with the fabled stories of Baghdad and the Caliphate, and they created the big jumps in science and civilization, and they also had political power. Then this Muslim civilization gradually declined, and then they got into a period of subjugation by other empires, internal divisions, and deterioration, degeneration, whatever we call it. And then in the 20th century, Muslims realized their sad state, and they are always searching for a way of reviving and going back to past glory. I found these sentiments are important for the purpose of intellectual history, because I can go and trace the origins of these ideas. When were they born? Because in many ways, and I'll try to go into in later part of the talk, is that there is no objective fact of a golden age or a decline of Muslim civilization or Islam. I can argue based on literacy, on wealth, on women's education, that perhaps 19th and 20th century are the golden age of Muslims in some ways. There are more people reading, there are more people who are highly educated. So those ideas of a decline and a golden age are constructed by a group of European scholars and Muslim modernists, mainly Muslims, in a certain particular context. And we should not assume that Muslims, purely by their belief in their religion, by their practices, form a shared global community of the Muslim world. But these are the questions that I want to start with, is that while we are declining to this idea of the Muslim world, that some people associate with Ummah, we should ask, is this really a Quranic concept that we are translating? And in the Quran, there are almost about 60 times there's a reference to the notion of a Muslim community in Ummah. And I am not a theologian, so I'm not going to go into the details on how to interpret this. I will have my own opinion. So there's this way, hadith that Prophet Muhammad in the hereafter will gather his Ummah around himself, and I think the song kind of refers to that as well. So Ummah could be, is not this geographical notion, it's not a civilizational notion, it's people who follow Prophet Muhammad, and it's trans-time, so all the people who lived after Muhammad, who followed Muhammad, constitute an Ummah, according to one interpretation. But in the late 19th century, many modernist, reformist Muslims or anti-colonial Muslim nationalists began to use Ummah and the Muslim world interchangeably. And I want to go back to this period and then try to kind of identify how this new meaning of the Ummah and the Muslim world emerged from 1880s to 1930s to get into its content. Before I do that, I would like to tell you, go back to earlier times and tell you that Muslims, about 100 years after Prophet Muhammad, were never united politically. They always lived in a very large geography. In fact, they were more or less united than, I will say, in the 18th century, even China or Europe, because the areas that the Muslims lived in the medieval times, in the European medieval times, were so large that you could not even walk from one side to another within a year. We have a very famous story of Ibn Battuta, who was the Muslim who traveled most of these places, almost 75,000 miles. But Ibn Battuta did not travel in a politically united Muslim world. It was a politically very divided Muslim world in the post-Mongolian period. So Muslim world was divided into multiple big empires, and I will get to this question of empires. So there was no political unity, but there were various networks of ideas, of religious beliefs, practices, of Sufism, of educational curriculum and institutions, and trade and pilgrimage that connected different Muslim societies. So we can talk about an Islamicate world of various networks rather than a united Islamic world in the 1500s. So that's title, I got it from somebody, that I don't agree that there is the Islamic world in 1500. And when we get to the empires, things get even more complicated, that we see a very new and unprecedented phenomenon of large-scale empires covering most of Eurasia, and especially the three big empires, Mughal, Safavid, and the Ottoman empires. And when we look at these empires, the emperors or the dynasties' beliefs in Islam or the tradition is unquestioned. They were Muslim dynasties who ruled these empires. But we also have to recognize that these empires cannot be explained by Islam. In order to understand these empires, maybe you should understand Islamic tradition and Muhammad, but you also need to know about Genghis Khan and the Mongolian imperial traditions, as well as Roman Empire, Alexander the Great. These empires were cosmopolitan, and actually the majority of the people lived in these empires were non-Muslim. The Mughal Empire had almost 60 to 70% non-Muslim population. The Ottoman Empire in the 16th century, about half of the population were non-Muslims. So in many ways, they had to be not representing the Muslim world, they have to be representing an imperial, universal identity going above religious divisions. So having said that, in that regard, I also always show these pictures to show the complexity of Muslim political imagination and cosmopolitanism. Here in one picture, an Indian Mughal Muslim emperor is embracing Persian king, and they have, both of them are Muslim rulers and Muslim monarchs, but their universalism and cosmopolitanism imagine a world of peace with the symbols of a lion and a lamb. And these kind of pictures are very important because with these pictures, they also have the very strong loyalty of their non-Muslim elites and intermediaries. So if you're a Hindu bureaucrat working for the Mughal emperor, this picture appeals to you a lot. You can believe in that picture as a Hindu bureaucrat, that the empire ruled by a Muslim dynasty, but it's also your empire that is working for universal peace and harmony, and there's a sort of cosmopolitan elite ruling these empires. And another good example that I always have is Suleiman the Magnificent, one of the well-celebrated Ottoman monarch of the 16th century. And here on the one side, you see his picture with a Muslim turban with very fine white silk that shows the power of the Ottoman silk industry, because they say that if that cloth was from British companies, he would have collapsed. It would have been very heavy. It's a very soft white silk that he's wearing from Bursa silk. So it is a kind of image of a Muslim monarch. And on the other hand, this is Suleiman's picture with a special European-style Roman emperor crown that he wore on his trips to Vienna or in Europe. So he could make the claim to be the Caesar and the inheritors of the Eastern Roman Empire, while equally being a Muslim. So they never see any contradiction between these terms and these ideas. And in some sense, if we go back to this earlier map, is that those empires or their Muslim dynasties, they are aware of each other, they're competing, and they do not imagine that they belong to a Muslim world. They share Muslim networks, but they didn't see themselves living in a world of Islam versus West or Islam versus Buddhism. Yes, I also want to kind of, with my last slide, also show the importance of their religious identity. I don't want to say either or, while they're being empires and cosmopolitan. And this is one of my favorite pictures in the sense that it is a depiction of an Ottoman crown prince, Cem Sultan, who loses the throne to his brother Bayezid and escapes to Europe. And that's it stays in Europe for about 8 to 10 years as a captive in France and in Italy. That's him actually, this person here, Cem Sultan, living with the Pope at that time. And this is the picture from 1490s. In his conversation with Pope, and this other person that looks Muslim is Pope's son, who was at that time Pope's hat son, who was such an admirer of the Ottomans and the Muslims that he dressed up like a Muslim. But the real Cem Sultan is there. At that point in this his captivity, Pope in Vatican wanted to convert this Ottoman prince to Christianity. But when he converts to Christianity, so Islam and Christianity are important, he says if you become Christian, you can unite the Middle East, in their mind, those areas, and Europe under your rule, under your empire. And meanwhile, Cem Sultan is a proud Muslim. He said, oh, why don't you become Muslim? Then we can unite. So he wanted to convert the Pope to Islam. They have a very interesting interfaith dialogue in many ways at that time in Vatican. And so I don't want, this I think in some ways shows the importance of imperial identities and as well as importance of religious ties. But I will insist that this also shows, even though in Pope's mind there's some sort of a Christendom, in Cem Sultan's mind there is no clear notion of an Islamic world. Hence, even if you get to the very famous battles of Vienna 1683, which inspired Anders Breivik, who did the Norwegian massacre, the 400-year anniversary of the Battle of Vienna, he thought he will expel all Muslims from Europe. But if you look at Vienna, it says Christian Europe repels the Ottomans. There are so many books about Vienna, Battle of Vienna as a battle between Islam and Christianity. If we actually, as historians, go back to the detail, that's an imperial war. It's not a war of religion. And there are Christians in the Ottoman army. There are Muslims in the Polish army that came to fight the Ottomans. And it's a very ironic thing how contemporary historical narratives, especially History Channel documentaries, kind of reproduce this moment from the perspective of the Islamic world versus Europe, although in reality, it was not like that. Before I get to the real topic, I want to give these backgrounds to kind of at least tell you some of the historical interpretations based on the idea of Islam and the West, to also talk about the coffee houses, because I have very good coffee houses in Abu Dhabi in the last 2 days. And as many of you know, that both the coffee and the coffee house is originated in Arabia, in this area, from Yemen to Damascus, then to Istanbul, Cairo, in the 16th century. And why I show this to my students, and I want to kind of mention this, is that we also shouldn't see history as a history of Islam on the one hand, Europe on the other hand, which a lot of people teach history that way. Because in the case of the coffee houses, we see that Muslims were not traditional stagnant societies. They were the ones who probably invented one of the biggest inventions of modernity, the caffeinated, regulated life, also conquering the night, that don't sleep at night. Probably this is the most modern inventions in history. And this is one of the Ottoman mobile coffee houses. But immediately, coffee going to Europe, to Vienna, to London, and becoming one of the foundations of modern European enlightenment. So when I got to this late 19th century construction of the Muslim, I want to kind of remind us that we do not have this segmented, separated histories of Muslims versus Europeans or Asians. That history has always been connected. And there are always many different ways of living together in a cosmopolitan, complex ways. So having said that, now we get to this 19th century, which is constructed as a period of European expansion to the Muslim societies and an immediate Pan-Islamic and Muslim response to European societies. There, I will also remind us that in the initial European expansion in Muslim societies, whether British in India, French in Algeria, Russians in Crimea and Caucasia, yes, we do see some sort of the questioning of the Muslims living under Christian monarchs, but we do not see any early Pan-Islamic unity and solidarity. Why? Because until 1870s and 1880s, and afterwards as well, we live in a world of empires. Empires expand, rule different populations, and you may prefer one empire over another, but it's a natural thing that the world is a world of empires. And when Muslims began to live under the rule of a Christian monarch, after some sort of questioning of identity and how it works, many of them did adjust to live under a Christian ruler. In that regard, in the early European expansion and the Muslim response, we actually see a shared construction of shared values around the idea of a civilized empire, and best exemplified with the Ottoman reforms, and this is Hayreddin of Tunisia in this kind of Ottoman fez and a white horse. And in this picture, we see the Ottoman Sultan Abdulaziz with French Emperor Napoleon during the 1867 visit to Europe. As you will see, other than the fez, those gentlemen look very much alike. And in fact, from the perspective of 1850s, the world that they imagined that we will be living in right now will be the world of empires, ruling over very diverse cosmopolitan societies. They would not have imagined a world of nations. They will also have not imagined that the world will have this geopolitical clash of civilization images of Islam and the West. I think the early Muslim reformists, as well as European empires, imagined a more complex world without the Islam-West distinction. From that perspective, we should understand that when in 1857, Muslims in India rebelled against British for various reasons, the Ottoman Empire did not support the Muslims. In fact, they supported the British. In fact, the Ottoman Sultan donated money for the British Christians victims of the Muslim rebels. And from their perspectives, they were not being a sellout in some ways, because from the Ottoman perspectives is that there are a Muslim civilized monarch ruling over lots of Christians, of Bulgarians, Greeks, Romanians, and if they have a right to rule over Christians, and the British Queen at that time has a right to rule over Muslims. And he doesn't see any reason why there should be a Pan-Islamic unity against Christian imperialism. And the reverse is also true, and this is one of my favorite pictures of Napoleon. It's from a museum in France. And even when Napoleon came to Egypt at the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, that many of you would know that he did not say that he came to Christianize with the white man's civilizing mission. He said that he came as a friend of the Muslims, and he actually himself claimed to be a Muslim. And his claim to rule, his legitimacy, relied on getting rid of the oppressive Mamluks and creating a universal just rule of the French Empire. And at some point that he gets into trouble, and then he asks with the resistance, ulama al-Azhar, and he says, you need to recognize me. And they even discuss, whether he should be Muslim, whether he could be Muslim without circumcision, or we could still drink alcohol while being a Muslim emperor in Egypt. And it's very complex. I mean, didn't he really think that in Paris people will be upset if they find out that in Egypt he was talking about being Muslim? But I think that we need to take the universal cosmopolitan claims of empires of 1800 very seriously. That this is not an age of clash of civilizations yet. He feels comfortable that France has a right to rule over Egypt. In fact, Napoleon is a great supporter of the Sultan of Tipu in India, a Sultan of Mysore, fighting against the British. And during that fight, for example, another Muslim sultanate, Hyderabad, is on the side of the British, not on Mysore. And Mysore Sultan is supported by the French. And again, in the Ottoman Caliph or Ottoman Sultan did support the British, not the Mysore Sultan in that case. And I want to, as last slide, before the emergence of the Muslim world, I want to raise attention to mid-19th century transformation of the world that also involved Arabia and Egypt. And the most important one is 1869, I think, is the opening of the Suez Canal with a wonderful, great imperial party in that. So as you can see, the guest of honor in the opening of the Suez Canal, that's Austrian emperor wife, and there's some sort of wives of different monarchies as a guest of the Khedive of Egypt in that party, where as famously the Khedive said that with the opening of the Suez Canal, Egypt now became part of Europe. And I think he wouldn't be able to say this. This is 1869. The world has changed so much by 1890s that it would have been very difficult to say such a thing that Egypt is part of Europe. Because by 1869, we suddenly see a very strong demarcation of the world, almost a racialization of the world between the Muslim world and the Christian West. But I want you to kind of think that, and I argue that in my book, that this development happened very fast from 1860s to 1880s, and it was not inherited from the 18th century or the 17th century. This is a very new phenomenon. And I want to kind of discuss why this happened. Around the same time in 1860s, for example, in British India, even after they lost the rebellion, we see a figure like Sayyid Ahmed Khan, who famously known as a collaborationist. But from his own perspective, he's not a collaborationist. He is imagining a Muslim integration to the British Empire. He wants to make the British Empire, like the Mughals, more cosmopolitan, more inclusive. He wants to create a safe space for Muslims in the British Empire. And he is being rewarded by the British Empire with all these medals that he's carrying. And this kind of corresponds with what the Ottoman Empire is doing as a Muslim monarchy, is that they are having the first parliament in 1876. And in detail now, we know that this first parliament had almost 35% non-Muslims, Christians and Jews and Orthodox. It's almost looked like an interfaith gathering. It's reflecting all the diversity of the Ottoman Empire. And Sayyid Ahmed Khan famously said that as long as the Ottoman Empire and the British Empire gets along very well, it's great. I have my respect for the Ottoman Sultan. But he says if their interests are diverging, and if they have a conflict, as a British Muslim, my loyalty is to the British Empire. This is, again, 1860s. But what's going to happen, now I'm going to tell you what changed and how it changed, is that all of his students will disagree with him. All of Sayyid Ahmed Khan's students by 1900 will say that if there's a conflict between the Ottoman Empire and the British Empire, because we are Muslim, we should be on the side of the Ottoman Empire, or at least find a compromise. Even though they were still subjects of the British Empire. And I want us to think why this change happened. The change happens from 1870s onward with the first example of an Indonesian Muslims asking support from the Ottoman Empire against the Dutch. Then there's this big events are basically invasion of Tunisia and Egypt back-to-back in early 1880s. Then from 1880s to 1914 and World War I, there's a big global discussions on the decline of the Islamic civilization, the Muslim world, how they can be revived, and also the struggle against the racial otherization, or basically struggle against the Islamophobia in Europe. And this is kind of my summary of why from 1880s onward we see the Muslim world. One is that European imperial elites and public opinion turned to be more Islamophobic, anti-Muslim than before. So from Europe, there's a racialization of Muslims in 1880s onwards, a certain sense of dehumanization. For example, we have a very famous speech by Ernest Renan, Islam and Science, where he calls Islam as a Semitic, irrational religion, not compatible with science and progress. This speech in 1883, Renan, just a year after France invaded Tunisia, became the hottest topic in every big city from Russia to Istanbul to Bombay. Everybody is talking whether Islam can be modern, whether Muslims can be Muslim progress. And if you look at the speech, it will not even get a D. It will be an F paper if NYUAD student, Ernest Renan. It is full of contradictions. This senseless assertions. He says that Jesus is from the Middle East, but he's Hellenistic. But even if a Muslim's in Bosnia, because he is Muslim, he's Semitic. So he makes this argument. He says, if Muslims are proud that they had a great science and civilization in the past, but if there's any science, it must be either Christian Arabs, whose Christian Hellenistic side was stronger there than Arab Semitic side, or they are by Persian Muslims, then this time their Persian Aryan side is stronger than their Muslim Semitic side. So if you're Aryan, you can do science. But that speech immediately responded by Afghani and many others, but nevertheless it led to this debate is that there is something wrong with Muslims. They cannot be modern. They are colonized. Muslim reformists immediately talk back. So none of these European racist ideas about Muslims have been appropriated. And 1880s is a time where Muslim publishing is in its boom. There are magazines and journals all over Muslim capitals, and I think that's one of the clues why there is a sense of a new Muslim identity now. In Bombay, let's say in Cairo, in Istanbul, in Tabriz, in Tehran, in Baku, we see the rise of new reading Muslim public talking about these issues. What's happening? Why are we under Christian colonial rule? Why are our destinies is like that is that we are subjugated, we are humiliated. So in their discussions, they talk back. They say that Islam is compatible with science and progress. Our problem is colonialism and imperialism. You need to go. While Europeans are claiming that the Muslims cannot progress themselves, they need the civilizing mission and the guidance of the white people, white Christian people, and Islam is inferior, Muslim reformers immediately talk back in that way. This creates a new interpretation of Islamic tradition, Islamic history, and it creates a new network of Muslim intellectuals coming up with all the basic frameworks or basic themes that we know today. That history, golden age of Islam, and the Muslims always argued that it's not that they were racially impaired, that they declined, they're temporarily faltering or stumbling, they will rise up, they will get back. And I get to this map immediately is that by 1890, everybody began to draw a map like this of a Muslim world here in this green color. And I got this map from a very famous American missionary called Samuel Zwemer, who lived in Cairo, who also had interactions and connections with Muslim modernists like Rashid Rida and Muhammad Abduh. And Samuel Zwemer made this map as a guide for the missionaries in America. Just where are the Muslims, and how do you convert them to Christianity? And this green map is interesting in the sense that he divides where Muslims are living, and you could see that the Ottoman Empire is the 5th greatest Muslim power. Actually, the biggest Muslim empire is Great Britain. And he thinks that China has more Muslims, but even Dutch Empire, French Empire, the Russian Empire had more Muslims than the Ottoman Empire. But then, although they are in the empire, he divides them in a kind of colored zone. And this is quite interesting in the sense that this is the age of social Darwinism and racism. But the Muslims do not have a skin color. They're not yellow race. They are not black race. And their otherization comes through their religion. So Islam is, in a sense, become almost an equivalent of a skin color for people to distinguish them from others. It's almost a brown race. And in that debate, I want, these are the main actors of debate, but I want to talk about one person. This is William Gladstone, Liberal Prime Minister of British Empire. And the one at the top or left is Ernest Renan. This is, and these are the Muslims who talk back, Jamaluddin Afghani, Ottoman Shinasi, and Nama Kemal. But Gladstone is interesting in one sense, is that here is the prime minister of an empire whose Muslim population is more than his Christian populations. But he's evangelical, pious Christian. He represents the power of the public opinion. And he says very politically incorrect, very nasty things about Muslims. He calls the Ottomans as the anti-human specimen of humanity. He's never popular with Muslims, right? And he says that the Muslims are oppressing the Christians. And while he says, the Ottoman Empire is oppressing the Christians, Indian Muslims will kind of indicate is that if you are really liberating somebody, we are here. You can liberate us. And why are you trying to liberate the Bulgarian Christians? And he gets into this fight with the British Muslims called Abdullah Killiam. He's a very interesting figure. And Abdullah Killiam is on left upper part. And these are some of the famous Muslims who are defending Islam, but also they began to defend, ironically, they began to defend the Ottoman Empire, which is also very irrational because Ottoman Empire is an empire with lots of Christians and Greeks in it. And the Ottoman sultans carried the title of the caliph, and suddenly we see the popularity of the Ottoman Empire among the Muslims in other empires are increasing. And I think the reason is not that the Muslims are supposed to be politically united and they are religiously taught by their imams that they have to be loyal to the caliph, is that all of these Muslim reformists, and this is Alexander Russell Webb, but they're especially Indians, Abul Kalam Azad, Sayyid Amir Ali, Nadwi, and Arabs too, that in their critique of the empires that they live in, they say that we want to be equal. We want to have our dignity. You are the ones who are treating us as second-class, racially inferior citizens. And as long as you do that, if you're not giving us equality, we will empower ourselves by linking ourselves to the only Muslim empire, the Muslim monarch available, the Ottoman Sultan. And they say, look, Ottoman Sultan is better than you are. You think he's a sick man of Europe, but Ottoman Sultan is giving liberties and privileges to his Greek and Armenian subjects, which you never give us to give to the Muslims. And in that context, that there's a new content to this Muslim identity, that Muslims are humiliated, they need to get out of this humiliation, and there's a new interpretation of history, which is based on a conflict between Islam and the West. And I think it's kind of a reverse of how Europeans see history. Muslims always as a threat in Vienna, and the Muslims kind of reverse it and began to see modern imperialism as a new form of crusade, which wasn't like that. For Sayyid Ahmed Khan, modern imperialism was not crusade. They could have seen to have a Muslim identity within the British Empire. But by 1900, many of the Muslims and the others all talk about clash of civilizations. Not that they want it, that they don't want clash of civilization, but they say that Europeans are behaving as if they live in a world of clash of civilizations, and they are not going to make the Muslims in their empires equal citizens or equal subjects. And in that context, I also want to kind of add one more layer to this, is that there are a couple of ironies. For example, one irony that involves the UIA and this area is that Muslims' connection with each other increases with telegraph, with steamship. And ironically, the British Empire that is kind of contributing to more Muslim networking, more Muslim connections. It's the Thomas Cook and Company's steamships are carrying more pilgrims to Mecca. And easily and cheaply, there are more Malay Muslims or Chinese Muslims could come to not only Mecca, but also Cairo, and the Suez Canal will carry them to Istanbul as well. So this is not at the level of Islamophobia and a discourse, but in fact, in actual networking of mobility of people, there is an increasing awareness of connection among Muslims as well. I need to move on to a couple of more examples, and one other good example is the new Muslim humanitarianism, that they establish Red Crescent Society because as a big humanitarian organization, they couldn't do Red Cross, and that becomes a kind of an international NGO, although based in Istanbul, of Muslim humanitarianism. So where does this go? This goes to this awareness of the Muslim world identity contradicts with the imperial policies. And the Ottoman elites are very puzzled. What do we do with this, that everybody looking up to us? And for a long time, the Ottomans think that this is nonsense. We are an empire. For us, the Greeks and Armenians are more important than Muslims in India, which they are right. A Greek in Istanbul is more important for the Ottoman Sultan because he's his own subject. And if Indian Muslims like the Ottoman Sultan or not shouldn't matter, right? But when it comes towards the end of this inter-imperial rivalries, especially in World War I, the Ottoman Empire turns the sympathy, the Pan-Islamism, caliphate, and the Muslim world as a tool in imperial competition. And hence, they did something that is unthought of. They declared jihad, first time, against other European empires in World War I. And here you see the German agents in Afghanistan. And here, also at the bottom, Britain counters this with a similar idea of an Islamic world, with Lawrence of Arabia going to the Arabs in Mecca and finding an ally, saying that the Arabs should be the caliphs. The Ottomans are the bad Muslims, of decadent and degenerate Muslims. So they kind of try to mobilize this idea of the Muslim world. And even though in World War I, the Ottoman Empire loses, and for various reasons, the Ottoman Turkish government abolishes the caliphate, who lived in this beautiful palace, the caliph, the Muslim world idea continues in interwar period. In fact, both Germany and Italy believed that there is a Muslim world, and even in World War II, both Germany and Italy made a special propaganda to the Muslim world. They had special agents, special propaganda. Moreover, Japan, and this is the opening of the mosque in Tokyo, even Japan get into the idea that there is a Muslim world, and they need to take that Muslim world on their side while they are fighting against Britain. So the age of empire is gone. We live in an age of nationalism in 20s and 30s, and the idea of the Muslim world and the Pan-Islamic notion of history still survives all the way to 1940s and 50s. My last comments and my puzzle, and we will discuss more because I think I ran out of time, is that ironically, even today, this idea survives. If the Muslim world is a product of European imperialism and responses to it, and European Islamophobia, why didn't it disappear with the end of European imperialism, when Muslims were divided into 50 different nations? And that relates to today's question, why do we still talk about it? And one could say, well, imperialism is over, but Islamophobia is not over. That skin color racism was easier to battle and defeat, especially after Hitler's Holocaust, Nazism, Nazi racism, that racism was a bad thing. People then began to fight against racism. But they forget that Islamophobia was a form of racism, but it just didn't rely on the pigmentation of your skin's color. It relied on their religious identity, and they forgot to deal with it. So we have undealt question of, in European psyche, the Muslim other, as important as the black other. And in some ways, maybe they are the ones carrying it. Or in addition to that, we might also say that the Muslims' humiliation didn't end. Even though they all became independent with Algeria, there are still certain areas which doesn't have their freedom, like Palestine. And Muslims came out of colonialism in a very divided, very weak situation. We can say that China is a great power with a veto power at the UN. So there are many arguments where you can say that the Muslim world identity did not fade away like being black, like being yellow, being Asian. What is important for us to reflect on, perhaps, is that we should not see Pan-Islamic discourses and the Muslim identity, as my concluding remarks, as something we inherit from Quran or Prophet Muhammad from our religion. That I think there's an earlier traditional notion of Ummah, but I think the modern Muslim identity is very much a product of the late 19th century colonial condition. And if we just reflect on it, we might also go beyond this idea that there was a past glory that we need to go back. That whatever we think about the current divided, problematic conditions of Muslim societies and their issues, that if we actually not reflect on what we reify, we make this kind of sacred concept of the Muslim world with the golden age, we need to go back, we are not recognizing the real problem. We're not dealing with the issues that we face. It leads to this very romanticized image of a past glory that we need to go back. Maybe that should be one of my concluding remarks, that I think thinking through in a global intellectual history of how we came to this notion of the Muslim world and Muslim identity will help us to keep the good things about it. It's humanitarianism, it's internationalism, but also to overcome its negative legacies. Thank you very much.
It appears that you are making an interpretation through the prism of secular liberalism, basically wanting to rewrite Islamic belief there. In terms of textual evidences, without doubt, it's something which is known by necessity in terms of the Ummah. As you started off by saying, I'm not a theologian, and ended up by saying there's nothing in the Quran, and making interpretations in terms of text there. Maryland University in 2007, when they carried out a survey within the Muslim Ummah, they asked the question in terms of unity, if they believe that all the Muslim countries should be united under one country or a khilafah. Overwhelming majority says yes. So I think we've got two issues: the liberal secular interpretation of history and the Islamic belief, which appears to be clear cut without any doubt. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, thank you for the comment. I wanted to hear these comments too. There are a lot of people that, for various different reasons, they want to revive the caliphate. And I do want to show you these are the pictures of the daughters of the caliph, the last Ottoman caliph, who became very famous. So even when the caliphate was over, there's a time in 1924, some other Muslim monarch wanted to be caliph, the Khedive of Egypt, Sharif Hussein, then the Saudi king, even the Nizam of Hyderabad. And somehow once the empire is over, and there's kind of a different question, why did the Ankara government abolish the caliphate at the peak of its popularity? And I think our questioner's comment is interesting in that regard, is that caliphate was abolished not because it was weak in public opinion. It was abolished, ironically, when it was most politicized and most strongest, to the extent that even Shia Muslims in Iraq and India were supporting the caliphate. And I don't have the time, and it will be in my book to explain why the Ankara government did. It was a very controversial decision. There were a lot of Muslims who, in Turkey, who wanted to keep the caliph. This is the last caliph who who was there. But the reasons, I think the project of reviving the caliphate had many different political agendas. One of them, and I'm from Istanbul, one of them is part of Turkish nationalism. I mean, a lot of Turks would think that if they kept the caliph there, it could have been a part of the Turkish foreign policy, public diplomacy, soft power. It would have been great. It would attract tourists to Istanbul. Then there are other people who had other reasons. Actually, people who had most interested in caliphate recently was, after September 11, American conservatives, who were very, and they kind of misdiagnosed. They think that the British Empire abolished the caliphate. Actually, Turkish government did it. And they said that the power of the caliphate now resides with the parliament in Ankara. So technically, caliphate is not abolished. It's just represented by the Turkish parliament in Ankara, which nobody cares anymore. And the conservatives in Washington, D.C. would say that, you know, we wish that there was this big brother and a big somebody who's well-educated, speaks French, who likes actually painting his daughter's face. He was a painter. He swam in that water as a beach. We wish that there's somebody like that to kind of give Muslims an example of a political dignity and a leadership. This way we didn't have to deal with Al-Qaeda, and we will have because when the caliphate was very popular, we actually have very few radical groups, so-called radical groups, very few messianic movements. In fact, if you go back 100 years earlier now, in 1913, East Asia and Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, had more messianic movements, like Boxer Rebellion, Taiping Rebellion earlier in China, compared to Muslim societies. Muslim societies are largely into the high-gear modernism, a reform. And I think part of the reason is that they did have a caliph, and the caliph's tone is that we need to empower ourselves both as an empire, but also empower ourselves in the empires that we live in. But of course, the problem, and there are many problems with this narrative, is that it was also caliphate coupled with the age of empire. And we do not forget that Turkey had about 1 million Armenians living in that country. And just a year after the abolishment of the caliphate, these Armenians were forcefully relocated to another place. And about maybe 500,000 of them died and perished. And I think that debate in that regard is very important, is that what is more important? That the well-being and integration of the Armenians as Christians to the Ottoman Empire and his legitimacy in the eyes of Armenian subjects. Could he be caliph of the Indian Muslims and still be accepted by the Armenian subjects? And the reverse is equally true. Why is Queen Victoria could be Christian and head of the Anglican Church and be the queen of Hindus and Muslims in India, empress of Hindus and Muslims? And I think these leads to issues of the viability of the empires, and empowered publics who want something more. And I think old deal of a cosmopolitan empire is not working. And Suleiman the Magnificent could be the monarch of Christians and Hungarians and Jews and Muslims, but it was more difficult for this caliph or this sultan to do the same. I don't have a direct answer to this, and I insist that I'm not a theologian, so you will have that interpretation. I respect that.
Thanks for the lively and colorful speech. I believe that Pan-Islamism, it has two forms. One is radical Pan-Islamism, advocating the removal of all borders in order to form one Islamic state under one Khalifa, and the other is moderate Pan-Islamism, advocating simply the harmony between Muslim states.
Yeah.
I guess the first one has no chance to survive, but the second one has some chance to survive. May I have your comments?
Yes, absolutely. I think if the conclusion you had from my talk, I'll be honored. If that is the conclusion, and that's what I was trying to get at there, is that once we get into the political project for empire and nationalism, this idea that 1.5 billion Muslims all over the world who were never being united after Imam Ali, that will be united politically, is a dream, and it will never be able to do that under one caliph. Who would you agree? I mean, I think there's a joke that even Imam Mehdi comes back to the world today he will be confused. I mean, he will be tried and put in jail in one country compared to others, especially last 10 years. Look at what happened to Syria. It's a great tragedy, and we have to face these issues. Why did this happen? And you can blame this person and that person, but in that level, it's not working. But on the other hand, we are living in a very global world where internationalism is very important. We honored Mandela today, and in Mandela's struggle, Muslims were very important, right? That he had Muslim colleagues. In Gandhi's struggle, Gandhi was a member of the Khilafat movement. And the reason why he became a member of the Khilafat movement is also a vision of anti-colonial internationalism. Gandhi's early struggle actually is around mosques in South Africa, that, when he burns the certificates. And as part of this internationalism, you could make this argument is that perhaps Muslims have more drastic problems that American public opinion doesn't care. In fact, they, look at Syria, they didn't care about Syria. President Obama, part of the reasons why he didn't want to do anything, whether you want him to do any military intervention or not, but he could have done something else without the military intervention, because I think it doesn't really make that hard connection. It's just Arabs are killing each other. There's a sense of Orientalism. We don't understand what these guys are up to. In that regard, maybe we need a stronger Pan-Islamism of humanitarian intervention and solidarity among professionals, among students, among women's organizations. Not the individual and the symbol caliph, but a stronger international civil society Pan-Islamism would be probably needed more than ever today in that regard. And that's why I showed the picture of Red Crescent, probably the most Pan-Islamic, successful Pan-Islamic organization of 1900s. And there could be many other cases like that. Thank you.
I just was wondering if you would comment on whether or not you believe that Pan-Islamism is growing today. I mean, you mentioned earlier that, of course, that it was growing since the 70s, 1870s, but now with the emergence of nationalism and then, of course, the states here in the Gulf, is it something that's, well, like I say, growing or disintegrating?
Yeah. There are several areas where there's a sense of a Pan-Islamic identity growing, especially after September 11. I think part of Pan-Islamism is the European racism and European Islamophobia. So, Danish cartoon crisis, post-September 11 that you want to build a mosque in Tennessee, and they tried to burn that mosque, right? Or in 1969, actually, the first Pan-Islamic international organization, the Organization of Islamic Conference, now headquarters in Jeddah, was established after the arson attack in Jerusalem, in Holy Mosque. So when there are more attacks on Muslims in terms of racism, there is, irrespective of who you are, like in Bosnia, even if you are not a practicing Muslims, if they are arresting you or not letting you into America just because you're Muslim, then that leads to a stronger Muslim identity. Moreover, there is more, with globalization, there is more interaction among Muslims. I mean, this country is a good example of it. There are people moving around, and I think at the end of the Cold War, this economic globalization also create a stronger Muslim mobility in that regard. But on the other hand, despite all these positive signs of Muslim cooperation and solidarity on a civil society level, in economics, in intellectual life, there are also many divisions and problems. Not only national, but just the Middle Eastern ideological competition between Iran and Egypt and Saudi Arabia, Turkey, different models. There is kind of unsettledness of even the basic ideological framework of how to create a good government. And it is, in that sense, it's quite tragic because I'm also a scholar of East Asia, and actually today East Asia is back to its greatness, right? China is the second biggest economy, and a lot of people talk about that the world is no longer Eurocentric. Whenever I feel like I go to China or Shanghai, I feel like living in America, I'm behind everything, right? They're doing something important. I feel like Commodore Perry's ships, Chinese one time come to America and open America to the world. So there's a sense of excitement in East Asia, actually in Southeast Asia too. So in some sense, it became very tragic that at least the certain parts of the Middle East is going through a very difficult time. So there's a contrast. There's an awareness of an identity and a need for solidarity. There's more networking, but there's also more divisions. Yeah.
I would like to ask, what do you think about the effect of the internet on Pan-Islamism and the Ummah in general?
It is, in some ways, very positive. Although I think the content about Muslims in internet is probably less than, internet in China is a bigger thing. Yes, internet, I think, is creating the big excitement. But we should not forget that when they had the Telegraph and the first Muslim newspapers, they had a similar excitement about it. So we should not make the internet as the beginning of the new life. Actually, Al-Manar magazine, for example, in Cairo, had subscribers in Russia, in China, in Singapore, to the extent that Rashid Rida once said that with Al-Manar's subscription list, I realized that the Muslim world is much bigger than the world of the Ottomans, right? So there were other moments where new medium of communication technology led to new openings and intensification of Muslim networking. Internet is one of them, definitely is important. I mean, but also Al Jazeera, or this kind of satellite television, is important. I think it brought Arab publics together in some sense. There are multiple satellite channels. And in contrast to 100 years ago, of course, the language became a problem. 100 years ago, many of the Muslim elites in Istanbul or Iran or in Singapore or Russia, they could read Arabic. Now, the new Pan-Islamism had to come through English language. So even when Muslims get together, they speak in a different medium. So maybe we should study this more, whether the internet is helping to move forward.